Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for the Technology, Media, and Telecom Group at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we will be discussing financial technologies, Fintech, the coming 451NEXUS conference, which will be opening up shortly, with Jordan McKee, Research Director for the Fintech channel. Jordan, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. And holy cow, do we have a lot of things to talk about. A lot of things that are happening not only from the 451NEXUS side, but also from the Fintech Focus side. The Fintech channel is our newest focused research channel. Can you tell me a little bit about it and what you're doing?
I'd be happy to. So you're right. We are officially off the ground with our new Fintech research channel. Very excited to have that live. It's an area where we've gotten a ton of inquiries from clients around over the past couple years and really felt like now was the right time to pull something together a bit more formal with more research, more data, more headcount behind it. If I were to characterize the channel, I guess quite obviously we're looking at the intersection of finance and technology. But really what we're interested in are the new value propositions, the new business outcomes that are emerging around that intersection. And when I think about our focus, as it relates to fintech, really it's three areas that we're interested in. We're interested in the evolution of how financial products are being operated, how they're being distributed to the end user, and how those end users are consuming them. And we know there's been a ton of transformation across those three areas. And when we think about the vendors that play in the fintech space, we're following them also from three different vantage points. We want to understand how fintech vendors are bringing greater efficiency to the global financial system, how they're making those financial products more effective, and importantly, how they're making those financial products more inclusive, right? How are they helping to serve those that have been disenfranchised by the existing ecosystem of financial participants and providers? So very excited to pull together some formal research around this, consumer surveys, enterprise surveys, SME surveys, really trying to get under the hood of how different end users of financial products and services are gravitating towards fintech providers and the different types of experiences and outcomes they're having when working with those new entrants into the ecosystem.
Well, listeners of the Next in Tech podcast will be familiar with the research work that you and your team's been doing. I mean, we had Michaela Wooldridge on talking about buy now, pay later. I don't know how many times we've punched your guest card coming back here in terms of payments in the various aspects of payments. So this is really an additional focus and, as you're identifying, additional resources put behind this because we've come to a point at which the payments and payments industry are now becoming a much larger part of that overall technology stack. Something that used to really be added in from the side now is fully integrated for most of the folks in market, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And as you said, payments has been core to our research agenda probably for the past 10 or so years. And what we've noted, especially over the past couple of years, is that the asks today are much bigger than payments. Certainly a lot of interest there, certainly an area we'll continue to go deep, but we're getting asks pertaining to lending, right? How is lending becoming more embedded into software applications? How are things like buy now, pay later starting to reshape the relationship that consumers have with credit? We're getting questions pertaining to the banking industry and how are non-bank providers, software companies, technology companies increasingly embedding banking into their suite of capabilities to drive revenue, to better engage with their customers, and what types of vendors are emerging around that to support those non-banks with the infrastructure they need. So as the asks have increased, we're broadening beyond payments into a whole variety of different areas and also starting to expand our geographic focus as well. So very excited to have a new analyst on our team, Sampath Sharma, who is leading our coverage of fintech in the Asia Pacific region, which is arguably the most important fintech market in the world at the moment. And he's producing a ton of great research that's really detailing not only how that market is evolving, but best practices in the APAC region that can be applied to other markets throughout the world.
Yeah, it was, as we've discussed on previous episodes, the level of penetration of fintech and the integration into regular consumer culture is something that's been so much deeper in APAC That's an area in which it's just fascinating to watch that evolution and watch a lot of the rest of the world catch up.
Totally agree. I think where we're moving is a world where financial products and services are increasingly integrated into the applications, the experiences that we're already using, rather than being bolted on or living, alongside our daily life and our daily activities. And certainly, APAC has been the first mover with that trend, as we've seen with experiences like Alipay and WeChat Pay that are not just about payments and banking products, but really about a full range of services that a consumer is going to need to interface with throughout their day or their week. And so I think that is the direction to travel. And it's very interesting to see that now moving beyond APAC into so many other markets around the world.
I'm sure Twitter X is going to be right behind that, right?
Absolutely.
Other places we won't go on the podcast.
Yeah, point for the best.
Well, the one of the places I do want to go, though, is into 451NEXUS, because you're leading a session at 451NEXUS at Payments. What are you going to be talking about?
Yeah, so I'll be talking about the future of payments and really where the payments industry is headed, and more specifically, what enterprises need to know as they start to pull together a payment strategy and build payment infrastructure that's going to put them on the right footing for the future. And really what we'll be getting into is first the challenges that enterprises are up against, specifically thinking about merchants, retailers, different types of entities that engage with consumers. As we know, they're feeling a whole bunch of different pressures that are squeezing them on the top line, squeezing them on the bottom line. Customer acquisition costs are increasing. Customers are pushing them to offer things like buy online, pick up in store, and 2-hour delivery windows. That's creating a whole bunch of operational shifts, and they're also feeling pressure from fraud and other factors that are pinching them on the bottom line. So the point is that there is a greater need than ever for optimization. And the argument that we're going to be making in the session is that really of all the areas that an enterprise could look across their organization for optimization opportunities, the ROI that they're going to see from optimizing payments is arguably going to be much higher than many of the other areas they'd look. And so we'll be getting into the specific tactics that enterprises can pursue to build a payment strategy and a payment stack that's going to put them on the right footing over the next few years, talking about strategies they can use to reduce their cost of acceptance, which is certainly top of mind right now as costs are increasing, talking about how they can increase their transaction success rates by offering alternative payment methods and doubling down on fraud prevention, talking about strategies they can use to streamline their payment operations and more effectively allocate headcount across their business and use things like payment orchestration, and also talking about the role of payment data in terms of personalization and personalization strategies that they can build around that. So really the goal is to discuss how an enterprise can really start to think about payments more strategically and use it as something of a competitive differentiator as they plan for, what could be a few challenging years ahead.
Well, I think most organizations have sort of thought about payments as the ultimate part of customer experience. That's the thing that happened in the end. And as such, it was critically important. But of course, that's the point at which you're gathering so much data about the customer. It's the point at which you ought to also bring to the table everything that you know already. So the data management pieces really span that entire customer experience from beginning to end in terms of what that customer sees, what they get offered, as well as the final transaction details.
That's it. I mean, I really think of payments as the inflection point of the customer journey. And, I'm a payments guy, so I'll say this, right? I think it's probably the most important part of the customer journey because as an enterprise, you can throw as much money as you want into marketing, into advertising, into your digital experience. But if you don't get the payments piece right, all of those investments you've made further up the funnel are essentially squandered because payments, that stage where your prospect is about to transition to become a customer, and there's so much that can go wrong at that stage. They might not get served up the payment method that they're looking to use. They might experience a false decline in the transaction flow. That merchant's payment processor or gateway might experience an outage and that transaction fails. So if you're not focusing on that stage right there, right, your entire customer journey is essentially broken. So we've really seen that become a priority, especially over the past handful of years here as more transactions have gone digital and as the stakes have become higher around sort of streamlining and ironing out that journey from start to finish.
No, it's the final proof point. I mean, that's where revenue gets generated. It's where that the ultimate customer decision actually comes down to. So, yeah, interesting places. So, when we start thinking about where a lot of those thoughts are going for overall payments within those environments, there is so much that we're covering across 451NEXUS and all of the technology pieces that are part of that complete stack. So it's great to be able to get that focus into what's happening at Nexus. And for listeners, I'll identify that starting October 31st, and if you're catching up with this episode after October 31st, you can go back, register, and catch these sessions that'll be online afterwards. But this is part of the much expanded portfolio of sessions and topics that we're going to be working through at 451NEXUS. Really the theme being taming the complexity of the digital next. When we talk about complexity, a lot of those customer experience pieces and payments in specific are such a big piece of all of that. So these are things that I think are a critical part of managing the technology perspectives, all those different pieces. You really start looking at this from beginning to end.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have a couple guests with me during this session. So I'll be starting off sharing some voice of the enterprise data, sort of detailing the state of the market. But we have two great sponsors that will be part of that session, Salesforce as well as Count. Count is a fraud prevention company owned by Equifax, and really they'll be discussing the role of fraud prevention within the customer experience and the importance of using things like large data networks to better understand digital identity, to better separate who your bad actors are and who your VIP customers are, so you can move towards a more dynamic approach to fraud prevention. And Salesforce, interestingly, is a new entrant into the payments ecosystem and really ties into this broader theme and trend around embedded finance. Traditionally a software company, they happen to offer some e-commerce software, and recently they've embedded payment processing capabilities within that, really sort of evolving what the distribution model looks like for payment services. So it'll be interesting to get some perspective from Salesforce as to how they see their role, wearing a couple different hats along the customer journey as both a provider of software and financial services.
Yeah, you mentioned fraud. That's an area that, hey, when I listen with the security side of my brain, it has evolved in so many interesting ways. Not only from detection, but I thought when Michaela was on, her comments about the fact that liability for fraud is so different across so many different types of payment engagements. That fundamentally changes a lot of the risk profile for how organizations should manage payments, what their expectations are, what's on the line in terms of managing fraud.
That's exactly right. And what's interesting about e-commerce, especially considering the growth that we've seen there over the past few years, is that when a fraudulent transaction occurs in e-commerce, the merchant is left holding the bag, and they have full financial responsibility for that financial fraud that has occurred. What we see in our voice of the enterprise data is that this is a growing problem. About 2/3 of merchants have told us that their fraud volumes have increased year over year. And what's interesting is that it's no longer just payment fraud that is the concern. Certainly they want to stop fraud at checkout, but we're seeing fraud move into so many different vectors across the customer journey. And now merchants are being faced with problems like account takeover fraud, where fraudsters are now hacking into a customer's loyalty account and potentially using their loyalty credentials, new account fraud, seeing things like policy abuse, where customers are increasingly abusing return policies, abusing refer a friend codes. And so merchants are now faced with fraud that occurs in so many different stages. And it's really shifting the industry to kind of look at fraud a bit differently and take a more holistic approach to identity and really understanding who you're interfacing with, not just at the checkout stage, but really from that first interaction. And pulling in unique identifiers, comparing those identifiers to past interactions to understand if behavior looks suspicious earlier on in the journey, and introducing friction a bit earlier than they might have previously.
But that means that a lot of that understanding that you get traditionally from the payments side really has to occur that much earlier on in that customer engagement.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I would say that is increasingly the direction of travel in the fraud prevention space, at least for e-commerce, is taking steps to understand who you're dealing with really from the first click, from the first tap, and starting to build out a profile of those interactions and using technologies that are pretty commonplace in the security space today, things like behavioral biometrics, things like device ID, to really understand, okay, who are we dealing with? Have we seen this person in the past? And if we haven't seen them, how can we compare these attributes, these identifiers to past interactions that we've had? And what was the outcome of those interactions? Was it a fraudulent transaction? Was it a good transaction? So identity data networks are increasingly at the heart of both payments and fraud prevention strategies today.
Well, it's the same story managing risk in any part of technology. There are a lot of different pieces. It's an ever-evolving environment, and you've got to ensure that you've got the telemetry to understand what's actually taking place and to be able to make more intelligent decisions about what's actually happening in your environment. Whether or not that happens to be payments, other aspects of tech, identity management, a lot of different angles.
Yeah, that's just it. And what's interesting, which we've also seen in our research, is that fraud losses are no longer the top concern that merchants have about fraud today. Actually, the number one concern that they have about fraud is the customer experience impact. And you can think about that from a few different angles. One is certainly the impact that it might have if a customer does experience a fraudulent transaction, how they might think about or perceive that merchant in the future, but also the friction that can occur. And if an enterprise does not have an optimized fraud prevention strategy, inevitably they're going to be introducing friction to their best customers, their most loyal customers, and that can tarnish the relationship that they have with those customers longer term. It can negatively impact customer lifetime value. So the big challenge that we're seeing in the space at the moment is, how do we effectively balance security and usability? An age-old problem, but really coming to life right now in e-commerce at the moment.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is one of the age-old problems with security, which is how do you make it easy enough, but still robust enough to be able to actually manage the risk that you're trying to address? It's always challenging.
It is indeed.
Well, I will point our listeners towards your session as well as the rest of the 451NEXUS content. There's actually a link in the show notes that will point you there. I hope that you'll join us then. A whole bunch of content that I'm sure you'll find interesting. And Jordan, thank you very much. This has been great. And we're going to have Sampath on to talk about Asia-Pacific concerns in the not too distant future.
I think he definitely should. He is a wealth of insight on that market and what's going on there, and would provide just a ton of perspective as to how fintechs and consumers as well are thinking about the future of financial services.
All right. Well, a marker taken in payments lingo there. Thank you very much. This has been great.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for hanging in there with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright and Ethan Zimmon on the marketing and events teams, and our studio lead, Kyle Cagnolosi. I hope that you will join us for our next episode, where we are going to be digging into another 451NEXUS session with Nick Patience, talking about scaling artificial intelligence and the underpinnings from a tech perspective on what actually sits underneath a lot of what's taking place in AI. So especially when we start thinking about things like fraud, there's a lot of computational work that has to get done in fraud detection. Nick's going to be talking about that. I hope you will join us then, because there is always something next in tech.